The Western Front in early 1917 was an industrial landscape of ruin. Shell-blasted fields, mud like wet cement, trenches that reeked of smoke, sweat, and the long decay of battle. But beneath this shattered world, another war was being fought, silent, claustrophobic, and lethal. It is into this world that Private Albert Joseph Edwards, newly arrived from Australia, first stepped. He had travelled more than 17,000 kilometres to join the first Australian tunnelling company, a unit unlike any other in the Allied forces. What he and his comrades did underground would shape the course of the war, and what happened there would shape the rest of his life. The Australian tunnelling companies were formed for one reason: to dig, mine, countermine, and fight in the dark. They were recruited from mining towns, industrial districts, and railway workshops across the country. Men who were small, wiry, strong, accustomed to confined spaces, able to work calmly in danger, and physically tough to endure brutal conditions. But tunnellers weren't only miners. Albert was a motor driver from Maitland. Not a traditional miner, but mechanically skilled, quick to learn, short, and physically resilient. Men like him were essential for operating pumps, machinery, ventilation, and underground logistics. Together, tunnellers formed a specialised workforce. Engineers, labourers, sappers, mechanics, and miners, all trained to fight the enemy below gravel. Some faces in the tunnelling companies stay with you. This is one of them. This is Sapper Lyle Ranger, just 17 years old when he enlisted at Newcastle. An apprentice tailor from Argenton, New South Wales. His portrait shows a boy wearing a man's uniform, the coat a little too large, the collar turned up, the slouch hat angled with youthful pride. He embarked from Melbourne on 25th of October 1916 on HMAT Ulysses, the very same ship that carried Albert Edwards to war. They may well have stood on the same deck, looking out over the same horizon, one a seasoned motor driver in his 20s, and the other practically still a child. Ranger entered the Underground War only weeks after arriving in France. In the tunnelling companies, youth offered no protection. The work was the same: shovelling, timbering, hauling spoil, listening for German counterminers in the dark. On 25th of April 1917, Anzac Day, just 6 months after leaving Australia, Lyle Ranger was killed in action in Belgium. He was still only 17, one of the youngest tunnellers to die on the Western Front. His story reminds us that the mining corps was not only made up of hardened men from the pits and railways. Some were boys who'd lied about their age, driven by duty, adventure, or the desire to stand shoulder to shoulder with older brothers and fathers. For Albert, sharing the Ulysses with men like Ranger meant sharing their fate too, knowing that any moment, any one of them could be gone. The war underground made no allowances for youth or inexperience. The earth itself became the enemy. To understand Albert's service, we must understand what tunnellers actually did. They dug galleries, long, narrow tunnels, extending toward German lines. And this work was performed in near total silence. Every tap of a pick controlled, every shovel of earth gently packed into sandbags, every bag passed hand to hand back down the gallery. At the end of each gallery, they placed explosives in massive underground chambers meant to obliterate entire sections of trenches. But the Germans were doing exactly the same at exactly the same time. This created a deadly cat-and-mouse game. Quiet digging toward each other, listening through stethoscopes pressed to the earth, counter-mining to destroy enemy tunnels, and sometimes breaking through into an opposing gallery, literally at arm's length. When tunnellers met underground, the weapon was rarely a rifle. It was a pick, a knife, a bag of ammonal thrown into the darkness. The tunnels were black, airless and humid. Candles guttered in the low oxygen air. Timber props groaned. The smell of wet soil mixed with explosives, carbide lamps, sweat and the suffocating presence of danger. This was the environment that Alphonsus entered and endured. By the time Albert joined the first Australian tunnelling company, their most famous achievement, the mines under Messine Ridge, had already been detonated. The explosion was so massive that witnesses claimed the shockwave was felt in London. In the aftermath of Messine, the losses mounted. Among them was sapper Alfred Jarman, who had sailed on the same troopship as Albert a year earlier. Jarman died on 13th of June 1917, only days after the great mine shattered the ridge. Like many tunnellers, his death was recorded simply, wounds received in action. No detail survives about exactly where he fell, whether in a listening gallery, a forward shaft, or while shoring up a collapsed tunnel. But his presence reminds us that tunnellers paid heavily for the ground gained beneath Hill 60 and the Ypres Salient. Albert was there in the same battles, the same months, breathing the same damp air and carrying the same risks. The line between survival and death for tunnellers was measured in inches of soil, seconds of warning, or simply sheer fortune. After Messine, tunnellers shifted to defensive mining, preventing German tunnellers from destroying Allied trenches, maintaining underground structures, and keeping vital listening posts active. This meant constant excavation, shoring, pumping water, counter-mining, and repairing damage from the shell fire above. And as always, the threat came from gas, collapse, and sudden death. The photograph I'm looking at now is from the Australian War Memorial and shows the ground north of Hill 60, a landscape torn apart not by artillery alone, but by the work of the first Australian tunnelling company. The crater you see was created by one of the massive underground mines detonated on 7th of June 1917. 123,500 pounds of explosive placed deep beneath German positions. The explosion was so powerful that it was heard in London. German reports claimed that an entire company of Württemberg surgeons vanished in an instant. By the time Albert arrived in France in early 1917, the men of the company he would soon join had already been fighting this underground war for years, digging and re-digging the galleries beneath Hill 60, losing them to German counterminers and seizing them back again in the dark. This shattered moonscape is the inheritance Albert stepped into, a battlefield shaped by engineering, endurance and sacrifice. And although he never dug at Hill 60 himself, the men alongside him had, men who carried the memory of these explosions, these tunnels, and the comrades they lost beneath this very ground. By the time Albert would join the first tunnelling company, the men had already endured one of the most tense and dangerous phases of their work beneath the shattered fields of Ploegsteert. Through February and the beginning of March 1917, the galleries were alive with the sounds of unseen enemies, a constant duel of pick, shovel, explosive charge and listening device. What survives in the company's war diary from this period is an unvarnished account of the subterranean struggle he was about to step into. The Australians were stationed beneath a sector where both sides were competing for the same ground, not above but under the lines. Each hour the miners worked or listened, knowing the enemy could be metres, sometimes only feet away. The diary entries reveal not only the physical danger of collapse or explosion, but the psychological strain of interpreting every creak, tremor and knock as potential signs of German counterminers plotting to break into their works. In mid-February, the tunnellers began noticing irregular vibrations in the ground. On 17th of February, the diary recorded, "A gallery reported loud knocking, visited without signs of tubes. This is surface repair work after bombardment." These kinds of distinctions really mattered. If the noise was surface movement, the threat was low. If it was underground, the danger was real and immediate. A misjudgment could mean entrapment or detonation beneath their feet. 2 days later, the reassurance faded. 6:20 p.m. The firing stops. Firing had ceased but could not distinguish much owing to our bombardment. Enemy mining voices were returning, faint, intermittent, but unmistakable to trained ears. The tension culminated on 21st of February when the company fired a major explosive charge under the German line. At 4:45 p.m, we fired the 500-pound aminal blow, wrecked away enemy lines to severe damage, 2 machine guns destroyed. For hours afterwards, enemy rifle and machine gun fire slackened, confirming the damage. Yet victory came with an immediate price. The force of the explosion shook the Australians' own tunnels. Blocks put in A gallery, B gallery blow-in, portion caved in. Even success in the underground war carried consequences. Collapses, air contamination, and the ever-present possibility that the enemy, detecting the explosion, would begin driving counter-tunnels ever further towards the Australian positions. Ironically, within a day, the diary noted a disturbing pattern. Noises distant only, iron hums, distinct working noises heard. And by the end of February, A gallery quiet except for occasional distant knocking. C gallery reports sounds of men trying to stop rush of water, metallic tapping. These short, stark observations capture the nature of subterranean warfare better than any later description. The tunnellers listened through geophones, stethoscopes on the timber, or simply by pressing an ear to the clay. They charted enemy movement with compass bearings. Bearings taken, A gallery 25 degrees, C gallery 39 degrees, 66, 49. The precision shows how seriously these sounds were treated. A few degrees variation could mean the difference between safety and disaster. By early March, the tone sharpened. Very good reporting noise in A gallery, noise hammering on hummocks with knockers as if counterwork. A gallery reports interference noises, distinct working in tunnel. These were not random vibrations. The German tunnellers were actually coming towards them. The diary's clipped military phrases do not display emotion, but between the lines lies the daily strain. Every man in the company knew that a single missound, a misinterpreted tremor, or a delayed response might give the enemy just enough time to fire a charge beneath them. This was the world Alphonsus would step into. Confined galleries buttressed with damp timber, candles that flickered in bad air, the smell of explosive fumes clinging to the clay, and the constant unsettling knowledge that somewhere in the darkness, beyond the tunnel face, lay the enemy. Albert's service record shows multiple hospitalisations as early as 1917. This was common amongst tunnellers. Bronchitis, influenza, trench foot, rheumatism, carbon monoxide poisoning, and recurring infections. The underground environment punished the lungs and skin. Every breath carried dust, fumes, and damp air. Tunnellers often worked half naked in heat and sludge, then emerging into the freezing night air. Fatigue was constant, breaks were short, labour was unending. And beneath it all, the knowledge that the Germans were listening. This is sapper Charles Cuthbertson of the First Australian Tunnelling Company. A young man from Australia photographed in a studio before he sailed for the Western Front. Look carefully, the uniform pressed, the posture formal, the face earnest and still unsure of what lay ahead. Charles died of wounds in France on 8th of October 1918, only a few weeks before the armistice. He was one of dozens of tunnellers who never came home. Their deaths rarely appeared in the headlines. Many died underground or from wounds received in the suffocating dark of the tunnels. When Albert survived with the First Tunnelling Company, it was alongside men like Charles, men who dug, listened, fought and carried explosives beneath enemy lines. Men who faced sudden cave-ins, deadly breakthroughs with German tunnellers, and by 1918, the increasing horrors of gas warfare. This photograph reminds us that every tunneller was an individual, a son, a friend, a young man standing in a studio, unaware that his war would end far from home, beneath foreign soil. By early 1918, the German army intensified the use of mustard gas, a weapon designed not to kill quickly, but to incapacitate, terrorise and permanently damage. Mustard gas caused blistering, eye destruction, temporary or permanent blindness, respiratory tract burns and internal lesions. And tunnellers were especially vulnerable because gas drifted to low areas and the tunnels collected vapours like reservoirs. Also, masks were unreliable in confined spaces and the mustard gas soaked into soil for days. It is in this environment that Albert was exposed. As the German army retreated in 1918, they left behind a landscape deliberately prepared for destruction. Bridges wide to blow, roads mined, buildings converted into traps. And at Peronne, the First Australian Tunnelling Company encountered one of the most dangerous of these relics. This photograph from the Australian War Memorial shows the shattered facade of the old cavalry barracks, built in 1833, a vast German military school before the Australians captured the town. When the Australian Ordnance Corps took over the complex, they discovered what the retreating Germans had intended: a demolition scheme designed to level the entire building. Large charges had already been detonated, tearing through supporting walls and collapsing the rear of the structure. But one mine remained unexploded, buried deep, hidden and wired to bring down the rest of the barracks. It was the tunnellers who found it. Men trained for the underground war were suddenly thrust into a new role, preventing catastrophe. They traced the leads, isolated the detonation systems and removed the mine before it could kill Australian soldiers repairing equipment inside the courtyard. In the foreground of this photograph, horse-drawn wagons and artillery pieces wait for repair. Captured German field guns sit ready to be turned back on their former owners. The Australian flag hangs over the barracks, a quiet symbol of victory and survival. For Albert Edwards, who by this stage had been repeatedly hospitalised from gas exposure, this episode reflects the broader story of his unit, not only fighting beneath the front lines, but saving lives by preventing disasters long after the guns had moved on. The war underground was never just about digging tunnels. It was about clearing mines, protecting civilians, safeguarding advancing troops, ensuring that nothing hidden beneath the surface could ever strike again.